This week, you need to review the incremental learning outcomes and have read chapters 3 and 4 and completed the worksheets. After you have completed the worksheets for the first and second chapter, then you can take the practice test before the first test, which covers chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4. There are no questions on the test for chapter 13. In chapter 3, the text covers different approaches to data collection, cases which are the units of analysis and research, and levels of measurement. The first two are rather elementary, which you can cover yourself in the text. The important emphasis in this chapter is levels of variable measurement. Levels of measurement are very important because it will determine the statistical techniques we use when we do analysis. Here we're going to discuss the 4 different levels. The first is nominal measurement, which are observations placed into sets of categories that have no direction. Examples of nominal measurements are gender, race, places of location, and party identification. These sets of categories have no direction because we cannot say that males, for instance, have more gender than do females. Another important note, a set of categories must be mutually exclusive, where only one observation can be placed in one category. And in addition to that, the category must be exhaustive, which means it must cover all the possibilities, all the range of possible answers. The second measure is ordinal measurement. Here, observations in a set of categories do have direction or order. In other words, observations in one category have more or less than do observations in other categories. For example, if we ask respondents their interest in politics, we can measure by asking them if they are very interested, somewhat interested, not very interested, or not interested at all. Obviously, people who are very interested in politics have more interest than those who are somewhat interested, or so forth, and so forth. It's important to note that all ranks are ordinal. Also, we cannot say that the intervals between categories of ordinal variables are equal. For instance, income categories such as under 20,000, 20,000 to 30,000, and over 30,000 tells us that the highest category is over 30,000 is more than the lowest category of under 20,000, but it doesn't really tell us by how much. It's not very specific. The third level is interval measurement. With interval measurement, real numbers are assigned to observations and there is equal distance between those numbers. However, there is no absolute zero in interval measurement, illustrated by the example of the Fahrenheit thermometer, which you can read about in your text. Interval measurement is not used very much at all in political science research. The fourth and last level of measurement is ratio measurement. Like interval measurement, there are real numbers assigned to observations that are equal in distance. But unlike interval measurement, ratio measurement does have an absolute 0 point. For example, income dollars, number of years of education, etc., are all ratio data. Finally, a word about dichotomous measurement, which is the classification of observations in only 2 categories that indicate the presence or absence of a characteristic. While a dichotomous measure may have characteristics of nominal measures, it can also be characteristic of an ordinal measurement. For example, categories such as yes and no, favor, oppose, and voter, non-voter have implied direction, while others such as Republican, Democrat, male, female, Catholic, Protestant are purely nominal data. So now we go to chapter 4, you're going to learn about the different types of variables. Political research is about explaining variation in political reality, and we need different types of variables to do so. For explanation to be possible, we need both a dependent variable and an independent variable. The dependent is the variable whose variation is to be explained. The independent is used to explain variation in the dependent. you should think of it as the independent having an effect on the dependent. For example, how does gender affect attitudes on the issue of abortion? In this example, gender is the independent because we want to see what effect it has on the issue of abortion, which is the dependent. As the text says, if you have questions about which is the independent and which is the dependent and which is the independent, ask yourself if it makes sense that a particular dependent and a particular independent would have an effect on a particular dependent. Another category of variables in intervening are intervening and antecedent variables. An intervening variable occurs between the independent and dependent variable and affects the relationship between them. As an example, education is often used to explain variation in political tolerance, but other variables may intervene in that relationship, such as a variable that measures exposure to social diversity. Antecedent variables, on the other hand, occur before the dependent and independent variables. In your text, the example is whether campaign contributions affect a legislator's vote on an issue of concern to an interest group. However, the text points out that the legislature may already be favorable to that issue before the contribution is made, which means the legislature's support for support was antecedent to the independent, in this case, the campaign contribution. In this example, the antecedent affected the independent, which in turn altered the relationship with the dependent. An antecedent can also affect both the independent and dependent without the independent affecting the dependent. Now let's talk a little bit about correlation and causality. Correlation refers to any relationship between two variables. However, it does not mean that one variable totally explains the variation in another variable, or even is the cause of that variation. It may just be pure coincidence, or there is another explanation for it. Consequently, we have to be very cautious in dealing with causality because an apparent causal relationship may be what is termed a spurious relationship, where another variable or variables actually cause the relationship. Think about what we just talked about regarding intervening and antecedent variables. A classic example of this is the correlation between ice cream sales and the crime rate, or the rate of crime. In actuality, weather is the antecedent variable which causes both variables to vary. If it is because of the possibility that a relationship may be spurious that we cannot prove causality in political science research. As a result, our research strategy is focused on disproving rather than improving.